Okay, hello students, and welcome to Soc 101, Introduction to Sociology, with me, your professor, Justine Hecht. It is great to be here with you all, as per usual. So this week I had originally planned on us talking a little bit about technology and artificial intelligence. But as I'm sure many of you are aware, there has been a crisis that has developed in both Israel and Palestine right now, and it's getting a lot of media attention because the crisis is very serious, right? We know that on October 7th, the organization of Hamas within the occupied territory of Palestine broke across the wall, the border wall between Gaza and Israel, and kidnapped about 200 people and also ended up killing and slaughtering 1,400 people that lived in the state of Israel. In response to that, the state of Israel has asserted its right to defend itself, and that in doing that, it has it's changed a little bit now, but originally it prevented any resources from coming into Gaza. The President Netanyahu had stated that there are no innocent civilians within Gaza, that all people within Gaza are responsible for what the group Hamas has done. And as such, we've seen a lot of really massive bombing campaigns by Israel into the Gaza Strip right now. Because people are not allowed to leave, they're running out of resources. We know that there's not enough water for people. They're left drinking salt water, which is of course not effective and actually very harmful. There's not enough food for people. There's not enough medical supplies. And so we really want to be thinking about the response by Israel. How overstated is it, right, compared to what Hamas has done as well, right? What kind of humanitarian crises are we seeing now as a result of the response that Israel is having to all the people within Palestine, not just Hamas, who did break in and kidnap folks, right? And so right now we're going to be seeing a lot of media about what is going on in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so rather than looking at AI this week, I thought that it would be much more useful for us to spend some time analyzing how media works and what messages media is sending to us in the United States about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and for what purpose. And so this week you're going to watch a documentary called Occupation of the American Mind. It was made in 2016, but it really spends a lot of time looking at the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict so we can kind of understand this current moment. Again, remember sociological imagination, the intersection of history and biography, right? And so we need a little bit of history in order to understand this particular moment in time, right? And then it's also really going to go into the role of the media in shaping our social imaginary, our social understanding about what is actually happening in Palestine and Gaza right now, right? And so we need to understand a little bit about what mass media is. Just the key channels through which a nation's symbols are transmitted and shared. This includes print media, includes digital media, as well as electronic means of communication, right? And so everything from, what you see on Fox News and MSNBC to what you see on social media as well, right? Or printed in the newspaper, or online blog sites or news sites, etc. These types of things, right? And so you'll notice there's this point about the nation's symbols being transmitted, right? And so if we go all the way back to Module 3 when we studied culture, we learned that there's different types of culture, that we have material culture, which would be the physical things that represent culture, and non-material culture, the more abstract ideas that inform our culture, right? And so, for example, the American flag is an example of physical culture because it is you can actually hold it, you can see it, you can feel it, right? If it's windy, you can kind of hear it, right? Which is kind of neat. And you can actually see and hold that symbol, right? That piece of material culture. But non-material culture is more about the ideas behind a society, right? And so when we look at the American flag, we know that it represents America, but then there's also ideas that are associated with America, such as democracy, individual freedom, property rights, so on and so forth, right? That you can't see in that flag, right? But intrinsically, as people who, assuming we grew up in the United States or that we have been naturalized into the United States, we have an understanding that the flag isn't just a piece of fabric, right? But that there's actually symbolic meaning behind it about how we understand freedom, right? And so the mass media is really a tool that enables a transmission of those non-material cultural values, right? So, one couple of things we have to consider when we're thinking about mass media is both this idea of homogenization and fragmentation. And I'm saying here in search of new or hidden stories to tell, right? Because as we're going to see, right, even though like Fox News and MSNBC may be seen as very different from each other, because Fox News is going to take on the conservative side and MSNBC is going to take on the more liberal side, Republicans, Democrats, right? When we actually look really close, we see that there's really only slight variations in the stories that are being told, right? We might notice that both Fox and MSNBC are talking about abortion. And on the one hand, Fox is saying that the overturning of Roe versus Wade is a great thing, that it helps to save the life of fetuses, right? That we're now having justice in society as a result. Whereas MSNBC, on the other hand, is going to say that the overturning of Roe versus Wade is a huge violation of women's rights, women's bodily autonomy, right? And that this is they're probably saying something along the lines of this is a movement backwards, so on and so forth. And so because Fox News and MSNBC are taking really culturally different positions, right, it gives the illusion that they actually have a different understanding, that they have different positions on abortion. But those differences are only really slight, right? Should you have an abortion? Should you not have abortion? Yes, it has significant policy changes, right? But is anybody, either of those organizations, talking about the economic impacts of being able to access abortion, or who will be able to continue to access abortion, even if it is made illegal across the United States, right? What are the financial issues that inform abortion? What are the racial issues that inform abortion? The sexuality issues, the gender issues, so on and so forth. So on the one hand, we have this almost this fragmentation, right? Where if you think abortion is wrong, you can go and look at Fox News all day long, right? And be given a lot of information that confirms your bias about abortion being wrong, right? Or if you believe abortion is right, you can go to MSNBC and get a lot of information that confirms your bias that abortion is right and just, right? And so it gives the illusion of difference, and because of this confirmation bias that occurs, right, it creates the illusion of a really fragmented society, right? But what we're actually seeing is that these stories are still framed around the same boundaries. They're using the same sources, the same interviewees, so on and so forth, right? As we really are wanting to think about why are certain stories being told, and why is it that even different news organizations that seem like they're on different sides are telling a very similar story, actually, right? So questions that we can ask when we're developing our media literacy, our ability to look at media critically, right, is whose voices and experiences are centralized and included? Whose are excluded or marginalized? Which group is this story about? Do we hear from all of those involved or just some? What adjectives are used to describe different events or groups? Do they generate fear, distrust, commonality, sameness, so on and so forth, right? So these are some of the things that we're wanting to be thinking about as we think about particularly the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and how it's being presented in the news today, right? Okay, so one of the things that we know is that over time, the ownership of media has narrowed quite a bit, right? So over the years, we have media consolidation, which is the process by which fewer and fewer owners, there are fewer and fewer media owners, right, and fewer independent media sources. So for example, in 1983, 50 different corporations owned mass media outlets. Today, in 2023, 5 corporations control 90%, let me jump right that, 5% of media outlets. This is Comcast, Disney, Time Warner, CBS, and Viacom. And as you can see here, I couldn't find a better image. This one's okay, but this gives you a list of which news networks are owned by which major corporations, right? So you can see here, I gotta lean in here to see this a little bit more, but you can see Disney owns ABC, ESPN, the Disney Channel, of course, National Geographic, History, 20th Century Fox, so on and so forth, right? Whereas the Fox News Network owns all things Fox, of course, but also the Big Ten Network, the Stars Group, right? Movies with an exclamation point at the end. My Network TV, so on and so forth. Comcast, on the other hand, owns NBC, Telemundo, Universal Features, Focus Features, and CNBC, MSNBC, Sci-Fi, so on and so forth, right? And so we have all of these different media channels, media organizations, right? And that give the illusion that they're all different, but we actually see that they're really only owned by 5 major corporations, right? And so we have to be thinking about, why does this matter, right? If everybody's just reporting the facts and reporting the news, right, or at least their version of it, why does this matter, right? And so this is where we get into something called Manufacturing Consent, which was a book written by Noam Chomsky many years ago. Noam Chomsky is a linguist and a scholar of history. He actually is a professor emeritus, which means a retired professor of University of Arizona. And he wrote this book called Manufacturing Consent to talk about the way in which media creates a story that all of us then end up agreeing to, essentially, right? And so let's think about this. We'll talk about this a little bit more in depth here, right? So I want to bring us back to Module 3 a little bit and think about this issue of cultural hegemony. This was by the theorist Antonio Gramsci, the Italian sociology theorist Antonio Gramsci, who was looking to understand how, if elites control society, and they control society by taking away resources from the lower classes, the oppressed, right? How does that even stay in place? You would think that everybody would be like, absolutely not, don't do that, right? But Gramsci explains that the way that the elite maintain power is by creating particular stories that are told to justify the inequalities or various oppressions that occur in a society, right? And so we can see here the definition of cultural hegemony, how the ruling class utilizes norms and institutions to maintain power in capitalist societies, right? So stories are presented not as a one-sided argument or position of a complex situation, but as the common sense view of society, right? So Noam Chomsky says that the primary function of the mass media in the United States is to mobilize public support for the special interests that dominate the government and private sector. He calls this a propaganda media model. Mass media sets the general agenda, the general framework, and for the stories that are told, and local media adapts to those structures, right? So what does this all mean? Right? So to mobilize public support for the special interest that dominate the government and the private sector, right? And so what Chomsky is getting here is that there might be a different interest that the public has than what those of special interest and of the government and the private sector have, right? And so in order to convince the public to support the interest of the government and private sector, right, the media has to tell certain stories that enables us to support this particular idea, right? So this really shows up in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which enables us to really study this idea, and then from there to apply it to other cases as well, right? And so Chomsky argues that this happens through 5 different filters: ownership, advertising, the media elite, flack, and the common enemy. So what is all this? Ownership. Big corporations and conglomerates are focused on profit. And thus, the stories that are going to enable profit are the ones that are going to get picked up and sold, right? Let me think of an example. Oh, I can't think of an example off the top of my head, of course, but we'll see it. We'll see it. I promise we'll see it in the documentary, okay? But we can just think about, right, like whose stories are being told here, right? And how do they generate profit for these particular media organizations, right? And on the other hand, right, there's the stories that that the media wants to tell because it generates profit. And then there's also the way that they get profit through advertising, right? So media costs a lot more than consumers pay, right? And so, we pay $11 a month, or what is it, $20 a month? I canceled my Netflix, but we can pay $20 a month for Netflix or whatever it might be, right? But the cost of Netflix is much more expensive than this, right? They're not going to make enough money with just us all paying $20 every month, right? And so to make up that cost, this is why we see advertisements, right? The, oh, I'm watching Hulu right now, and Liberty Mutual always has advertisements on Hulu, right? And so Liberty Mutual then will pay Hulu for advertising space, right? And so while media, the owners of media, are trying to sell you a product, right? In this case, Liberty Mutual is trying to sell me insurance, which I won't get because they were the first insurance company I ever had, and I didn't like them. So, but nonetheless, right? In this case, media is trying to sell you a product, which is Liberty Mutual insurance, right? And on the other hand, you are the product that Hulu is selling to Liberty Mutual, right? And so Hulu has an incentive both to view you as a product, right? To be sold to Liberty Mutual, and to allow Liberty Mutual to sell their products on their networks, right? And so what we're really seeing here is the way in which the media ownership and advertisement work together to facilitate the creation of profit, in which you yourself are actually a product being sold. This is very true on social media as well. Incredibly true on social media. There's a great documentary called, what's it called? The Social Dilemma. That's on Netflix. I highly recommend it as an addition to this, right? Okay, so ownership and advertising. Then we also have the role of the media elite. So these big major 5 corporations, right? Chomsky tells us that this negates, X's out, media's democratic check on power because it is controlled by the powerful, and so the system therefore encourages complicity. And so we can think back to the United States Constitution for this one, right? One of the First Amendment, on the First Amendment, it says that we have the right to freedom of speech and freedom of the press in particular, right? And the idea is that free press is essential for democracy, because when journalists are free to go report stories, they can tell us the facts of what's happening on the ground, they can tell us the complete version of a story, so on and so forth, and then we can use that story to help us inform the decisions we make about how our society should function, who we should vote for, all those kind of different things, right? But Chomsky says that because the media is owned by fewer and fewer groups of people, right, that it actually is not able to be a tool for check and balance on government and corporate power, right? Because the corporations themselves are directly connected to government power, and therefore they end up putting forward their own ideas, their own agendas about how society ought to be organized, right? And so we don't actually end up having a democratic check on government through the press, because the elites are actually controlling that system to begin with, right? So, control. So this is going to be things like controls who has access, what questions can and cannot be asked, right? And so, for example, if you're watching, if you're watching a live viewing of like President Biden giving a speech about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? And you see all the journalists in there who are raising their hands and asking questions, right? All of those journalists have been pre-selected and their questions have been screened beforehand, right? And so if there's a question being asked that the Biden administration or the Trump administration, Obama administration, doesn't matter who, right, doesn't like, then those journalists don't get to ask those questions during those press conferences, right? Or you might not be given a press pass for certain events if the journalist or if the media elite don't like the questions that you were asking, right? So the other side of this is flack, when the story is inconvenient for powers that be. Wow, my typing is atrocious here, y'all. Sorry about that. So the next thing here is flack. So this idea that when the story is inconvenient for the powers that be, the sources are discredited, the conversation is diverted. So for example, right now there's been mixed reporting over a hospital that was bombed in Gaza. Initial reports stated, well, this is complicated as well because media outside of the United States looks different. But in the United States, it was first reported that Israel bombed this hospital, and that killed many, many, many civilians. And then Israel pushed back on that narrative and the idea that that Hamas, it was a Hamas misfire that ended up firing this bomb in this hospital, right? And so now there's a debate about who did what, what's true, what's not true. And in the meantime, Israel is still bombing Palestine, right? In the meantime, Hamas still has hostages, right? And so now we're having this like debate about who bombed who, right? When we're not actually looking at the bigger picture of the human rights abuses that are happening within Palestine right now, right? And so stories become inconvenient, and then they can become tools to discredit or divert our attention from what is actually happening on the ground, right? And then this last one is really important here, this idea of a common enemy. This idea is very, very, very important for understanding media, not only in relationship to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right, but we can think back to when we watched Misrepresentation in Module 4 about socialization, about how fear of not being good enough, of not being pretty enough, right, enables advertisers to sell us all kinds of marked up goods to make sure that we do conform to those particular beauty standards. The same thing can be thought of in international relations as well, right? So the use of fear to consolidate consent. Someone to fear helps to corral public opinion. You may be vaguely familiar with the Cold War, but I'm sure you're familiar with the conflict between the United States and Russia, or the Soviet Union, between capitalism and communism. In the United States, communism is a thing to fear, right? Again, how many of us have actually read the Communist Manifesto and know what it says, right? But mass media tells us that communism is a thing to fear. I was just watching, what was I watching? X-Men last night, actually. I love X-Men, one of my favorites. And it's the, I can't remember the title of it, but it's the one, it's like one of the prequels with Professor X when he's young, and he, he's not been disabled yet. He's just starting his school for the X-Men and for mutants and all of this stuff, right? And even there, you can see this conflict between Russia and the United States, between communism and capitalism, in which the United States ideas about how society should be run are lifted up as the norm in the correct way, and the enemy then is communism, right? We also see this in discussion around terrorism, right? So I'm sure, I should do a survey to find out what you all learned about 9/11, because I was 16 when 9/11 happened. But nonetheless, we can see this issue, right, where the idea of this group of people is terrorists, and therefore we have a right to defend ourselves against this group of people because they are terrorists imposing terrorism on us, right? And there's nothing underneath that, right, about what might have caused the terrorism in the first place. We really saw this playing out after 9/11 when we were attacked by a militant group from the Middle East, right, from Al-Qaeda. And the idea that these groups were terrorists that we were at threat because of these groups, and that all Muslims then were therefore terrorists, right, which is absolutely not true, enabled us to go in and start bombing Iraq, when Iraq actually didn't have anything to do with 9/11 in the first place, right? We also see this around woke politics and the culture wars, right? This idea that, that we should be afraid of the people who are pushing forth ideas about racial justice, gender equality, so on and so forth, because they are members of the elite that are trying to control society. None of that is true, right? People just trying to get some justice, right? Whatever, right? But we see how the media can create a common enemy for us to fear that then goes on to justify public policy and international policy, right? So, yes. So, as you're working on your assignment for next week, or for this week, rather, these are the 5 filters I want you to think about as you are trying to identify if the media is manufacturing any type of consent around the Israel and Palestinian conflict. Right, so here are some other helpful tools for you to consider and questions to consider. We understand that symbolic boundaries demarcate demarcate who belongs to what groups, who is an insider and an outsider. This goes back to our discussion about insider groups and outsider groups. And so we have symbolic boundaries that demarcate those. So the idea of terrorist, not terrorist, for example. Bonding social capital. These are tools, cultural tools that allow people who are already socially tied to reinforce their sense of identity and group belonging. And social exclusion. Boundaries reinforce not only a sense of belonging, but also a sense of difference from those who are not one of us, right? And so as we're thinking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict right now, some questions could ask are which groups are positioned as victims, as terrorists, as militants? What stories does the media draw from? In other words, whose voices are they drawing from? Whose voices get uplifted? Whose voices get discredited, right? Does the media identify the root cause? And what are they identifying as the root cause? Religious zealotry, a product of settler colonialism, as equally violent on both sides? Is the root cause of this conflict actually obscured, right? And then who benefits from this framing at whose expense, right? And so I want to give you these questions to help you think through your analysis of different media forms this week, and to help us think through what is the purpose of mass media, right? Because right now mass media is going to play a huge role in how the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is understood, right? And it is very important that we are able to look at that media critically and understand the agendas and the stories that are being told within those media systems, right? And so then I just also wanted to give you some options for independent media because they're hard to find now. But again, this is going to be on the slides. This is on the slides for you. That's in the learning material, so you have access to this. But these are some of the ones that I use quite a bit. Democracy Now!, Truth Out, New Republic, The Guardian, Al Jazeera, BBC, Amnesty International, Black Agenda Report, Latino USA, The Marshall Project, and ProPublica. And so these are media companies, organizations, networks that are not owned by any of these 5 networks, right? Democracy Now!, for example, runs basically on, Democracy Now!, Truth Out, and The Guardian run, for example, off of public donation, right? Amnesty International is a nonprofit organization that does media reporting in the United States, but also internationally, right? All these different types of things. So if you want, this is a list for you to check out, see what you find. Okay, that's all I got for you today, folks. I'm very excited about what you all have to say about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict after this week's material. If you have any questions, of course, reach out. Otherwise, I'll see you next week. Take care. Bye-bye.